look at the camera, don't look at the screen. All right, good afternoon. I'm Lucinda Andriani. I'm Deputy County Manager, and I serve as the Coconino County Flood Control District Administrator. The past 2 days, we have held the Museum Long-Term Flood Mitigation Engineering Summit, and we brought together a brain trust of engineers from various consulting firms, from the city, from the flood control district, and brought together agency representatives. We had FEMA represented, we had the Arizona Department of Water Resources represented, Arizona Department of Transportation, and several other agencies participated as well. And I can say that, as I'll say, as the organizer of this event, I'm very pleased with the outcome. The level of thought and discussion that took place during the workshop session yesterday really demonstrated that we have a tremendous amount of capacity and capability on this team. And I think today you're going to see some of the high level ideas that came forward. And I say high level, these are conceptual level. We obviously, in a day and a half, there isn't the opportunity to look at any real feasibility of any of these concepts. But there was a tremendous amount of brainstorming and great ideas put on the table. I'm excited about moving this process forward. So with that, we're going to launch into the presentation. The overall, I'll walk through the participants and summit agenda, and then be turning it over to Joe Leverage to my left here, as well as to Julie Lead, who's to my left. I first, though, want to introduce the rest of the members of the summit, attendees at the summit. These individuals, some of them served as our what we call table leaders during the workshop session yesterday. To my far left is Mark Lamer. Many of you know Mark. He's been tireless efforts out in the museum flood area working with residents. And next to Mark is oh geez, I knew this would happen. Stephen Irwin. Sorry, Stephen. Stephen too has been out in the flood area working with many of you. Gary with the city, and Gary Miller as an engineer with the city. Julie, Joe, myself, Christopher Tressler serves as both the county engineer and the flood control district engineer. Andy Bertelson, public works director for the city. As well as Caleb Lanting with Peaks Engineering. And so these were the people who participated. Some of the people, we had over 50 participants. And again, just a truly robust discussion coming out of that brain trust. With that, I think I covered a number of the participants. We also had Flagstaff Unified School District, Army Corps of Engineers, and very, very importantly, the U.S. Forest Service. Matt McGrath, our Flagstaff Ranger on the Flagstaff Ranger District, participated in the entire 1.5 days and was a very important contributor to this discussion. And I think, as everyone is aware, they are a very important partner in moving forward. And then the consulting firms that were represented, that were participated with us, Civil Tech Engineering, J.E. Fuller, Natural Channel Design, Peak Engineering, Remal Engineering, SWI, and Woodson Engineering. And again, great contributions. The summit, how did we spend our day? Yesterday morning, we heard a number of presentations. Christopher provided a presentation looking at the background of the museum fire and the flooding, kind of laid the overarching concepts and context for the discussion. And then very importantly, Alan Hayden with Natural Channel Design and Chris Duza with Civil Tech, who were instrumental in the engineering and development and construction of the Schultz flood mitigation. They provided an overview of what took place with Schultz and the lessons learned. And I think that really, I frankly felt the tone of the whole room change. I think both from a perspective of how did you take on 8 watersheds? What did that process look like? What were the outcomes? And, you know, what was the engineering thinking behind that effort? And I think that really provided tremendous context and understanding about the venture that we're facing and the challenges we're facing and the opportunities. Then we turned to Corey Helton with J.E. Fuller, who did an overview of the monsoon rainfall data for this monsoon season, and to Joe Leverage, who really looked at the existing conditions of the watershed and system capacities. And then Julie rounded out those presentations looking at the flooding impacts. And then we moved to the afternoon workshop. And that afternoon workshop really, again, was the kind of the center of the brainstorming effort for yesterday afternoon. I wanted to share because it's so important. I think coming out of Schultz, this discussion about the lessons learned, and I really see these as key principles for moving forward with museum. And so this is kind of an amalgam of what did we learn from Schultz, and now what do we want to take forward from that experience and apply those principles to museum as we move forward with long-term mitigation. And I think top of the list here is forest restoration. As many are aware, only 52% of that watershed burned. And if the remainder of that watershed burns, anything that we design downstream will be compromised. And we don't, obviously, no one is interested in starting this process over. And so a top priority will be to secure the resources to complete the restoration in the areas that remain, which I believe Matt said was approximately 500 acres. So, but not only does it involve that, very importantly, they have to be able to have physical access to that area. And the roads up there have been destroyed through the flooding from this season. And so it will take significant resources to rebuild those roads so that the contractors can get in there and do the thinning that's necessary. Some of that area, you may look at the map and you may say, well, it's a bigger area than that, but some of that area is basically bare rock and there isn't anything to thin, but this forest restoration is really important. And then the next first key step is really the on-forest watershed restoration efforts. Very similarly to what we did in Schultz, that on-forest restoration, although unfortunately in this watershed, it's much more limited as we've discussed. That watershed restoration efforts to retain and wherever possible, fully utilize the alluvial fans that are up above Mount Eldon Estates and between Mount Eldon Estates and Paradise, utilize those to capture as much sediment and to slow down the water as much as we can. We can't necessarily reduce the volume of water, but reducing the sediment is fundamental because anything that gets improved downstream will be dysfunctional if we can't manage the sediment. And you'll hear that from Julie and Joe. So in effect, what's really important, and we really came to understand this through Schultz, is we need an integrated approach. We have to integrate the measures that we're doing up above Flagstaff and largely on the Forest Service lands with the measures downstream in the city. And it has to be an integrated conveyance. And then all the way through the city, it must be an integrated conveyance. This may mean that we have to reduce our expectations for what we can design to. How big a storm will this system be able to to be able to capture and manage. And again, I want to reiterate those feasibility criteria. It has to be technically, financially, we say socially here, but really it's technically, financially, legally, and then environmentally and culturally feasible. And that's the next steps, is to start looking at that feasibility. Unfortunately, we do have analytic tools that can help us make reasonable estimates of sediment loading and those reductions. And that's a first, you'll see that on the next, high on the list of next steps. On to the next slide here. I think one of the most important messages, and this is a tough message, but to deliver, but we will design to some target storm, possibly some range of storm level. You hear 100, 200, that type of thing. We're probably down in 5-10-year storms in terms of this post wildfire. But we will not be able to design to every storm. It is not physically possible. It's just not feasible. All those factors of feasibility won't let us design to every storm. What we do will help reduce the impacts during larger storms, but it won't eliminate those impacts. And that's really important to understand. So, and importantly, we really emphasize, and one of the important reasons to do this summit was it's about relationships. We really understood that with Schultz, like the bracelet relationship that we had with the Forest Service, the relationship that we had with the various regulatory agencies, the relationships we have with funders, the relationships that we have with the community. Relationships are key. And lastly, I want to caution people that when Joe and particularly Julie is going to walk through some of the ideas, the conceptual ideas that got put on the table, to understand that these are concepts. And people will want to walk away and they'll want to come back 6 months from now and say, well, you said you were going to do this, or you said you were going to do that. We have a long road to go. We have to look at the feasibility. There's a fair amount of technical work that has to be done up front. This was exactly the same in Schultz. We had to do all the analytic work to underlie the engineering that then has to take place to get projects in place. And for example, things like detention, you're going to see detention mentioned. Detention may not at all be feasible, because if we can't arrest enough sediment above those features, then it won't work. They won't work. They'll just fill up, and they'll create a maintenance nightmare and a major maintenance cost. And that was one of the key principles that we had with Schultz, was that we knew we had limited funds to maintain these facilities over the long term. And so how do we build a system that doesn't continue to have maintenance costs? Now, there's maintenance costs if we don't do anything as well. So that whole cost benefit analysis, what are the impacts, the cost of the impacts, cost of the impacts to the residents, cost of impacts to the city, to the district, and then there's the cost of the projects themselves. So, and every federal source that we seek out for funding requires a cost benefit analysis. So these are the kinds of things we'll now start to go down those paths as we work toward implementation. At first engineering, first feasibility, then engineering, and then into construction and implementation. So again, that afternoon session, here's some photographs here. You can see all the teams working together. Again, fabulous brain trust. So now we're going to move in. I'm going to turn it over to Joe and then Julie. Joe's going to speak to the hydrology initially. There was a lot of discussion about design, storm, and hydrology. And then we'll talk about the mitigation ideas. And again, just that sense of caution that these are ideas, and you're going to hear a lot of ideas, and they're not all going to get implemented because some overlap. And as you work through, you may add something else, and you may take some other piece of the puzzle. This is a very complicated puzzle that we're building. So With that, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Thank you, Lucinda. One of the main questions that we had to discuss during this is the hydrology. What is the design flow? How much water are we going to design the downstream infrastructure to, or mitigation alternatives that we come up with? To give a reference point, in Schultz, the 5-year, 6-hour design storm was chosen for all the improvements, and those varied in the corridors, varied from 200 to 400 CFS. And I'll give you a reference point when we're talking through some of the numbers on Spruce Avenue Wash. So the question is, for the museum fire, what is the year event? What is the probability of that event that we're designing to? What hour design storm? And how much recovery are we assuming will happen in the watershed over the next period of time when these improvements are being implemented? And to frame that in a little bit, give you a little bit of background on what some existing numbers, pre-fire numbers, are out there. So the FEMA flood insurance study, I'm not going to dive too much into the numbers, but it's a pretty low flow, 230 cubic feet per second. The Northeast Area Drainage Master Study from 2009 modeled that higher at 749 CFS at Paradise. So there's kind of a big variability in even pre-fire flows that could potentially come off the watershed. So to backtrack a little bit, the post-wildfire flood risk modeling that was performed in 2019, it was done for very specific rainfall events that were experienced in Schultz. Very intense 1-hour rainfall events that we wanted to provide a variability in what the downstream impacts were. So a 1-inch to a 3-inch storm event. For a point of reference, between pre-fire and post-fire, flows increased approximately 10 times in the modeling. So we have much higher flows as we've experienced in the 2-inch rainfall event. So far this season, to give a little bit of context to this discussion and why we are where we are, there's 4 rainfall gauges within the watershed. One of the gauges was installed in 2018, and you can see that in the green bar. That rain gauge had about 10 inches of rainfall on it in 2018. The next red bar and dark blue bar, these are the rainfall that we experienced in 2019 and 2020, very low, our period of monsoons, as it was termed. To date, in this monsoons, we're right about 10 inches plus or minus of rainfall, much higher than we've previously experienced and higher than normal for this time of year. So that gives a little context to why we are seeing the rainfall, the flooding impacts that we are.
And monsoons are not finished yet.
Correct. Monsoons are not done yet. So I'm not going to dive too much into this slide, but what I want to express with this is that each of these rainstorms, this is a dynamic watershed. It's constantly changing in channel conditions. Every storm is unique that impacts the watershed. And we as a team are keeping very close eye on how each of these storms impact the watershed, what that looks like downstream, and taking that into consideration when we're planning for mitigation alternatives. So give a little context also now for a couple of the flood events that we've experienced. Let's do the first one and the last one last week. So the first one ranged approximate range is 500 to 800 CFS by the time you hit Linda Vista, to put some bounds on that. And the storm event this last week was in the range of 1,000 to 1,500. So it was a lot larger as we experienced, as we saw in the watershed, the higher rainfall values. So much higher than you're ever going to experience pre-fire. And that's what we have to wrestle with at this point. Okay, so we identifying what our design discharges is a complicated discussion. Something that we've wrestled with over the last couple of days, and we're beginning to put some brackets on what we think are design storms that are not only feasible to design to, but also provide a relative level of mitigation for the impacted areas. So we want to consider how does our selected design storm compare to what we've observed this monsoons? And then looking forward, what's this watershed going to look like in 10 years? How much recovery is going to happen? And then how does all of those, all of that variability in the watershed play into our current system? You know, we have constraints like I-40 and the BNSF railroad crossing downstream of Route 66. We have constraints of existing infrastructure, and so these are all components that we're wrestling with to try and determine the design discharge that gives us the most benefit that we can reasonably implement. Some considerations also are what happens upstream. How much sediment and debris is managed on the alluvial fans upstream of Mount Eldon Estates. And if there is any attenuation, reduction in flow rates through detention, if that's even a possibility, and that, like Lucinda said, we really need to now dig into the details of that. And again, using this design discharge to then understand what potential adverse impacts are with each one of these projects that we're going to talk through. And with that, to go along with that, the feasibility criteria. So we're in the conceptual phase. We're in the idea to conceptual phase. And what needs to happen from here is understanding the feasibility. So this is from like Lucinda said, it's from the technical, financial, legal, and environmental and cultural from aspects. And there's a lot that wraps into that. And as a team, we'll be honing in on what our design discharge is, and we are not quite there yet, but we're moving towards understanding that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Julie.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. Good afternoon, everybody. And the work that you're going to see and that I'm planning to explain, we finished talking about not quite an hour ago. And it's great because I'm joined here at the table with the table leads. So the way the afternoon session worked out, we had individual groups, table leaders here that were all day yesterday afternoon working on possible mitigation strategies. And then we had a complete report out this morning and further discussion as an entire group. So it's great. I've got Mark, Stephen, Gary, Joe, and Christopher and Caleb, who are all table leaders here to help support as we walk through and have a conversation about some of these strategies. But there were some themes that came up throughout the conversation. So general themes that you'll see as I talk more about these strategies. Routing is downstream up. So I talk about routing, I'm talking about storm drain infrastructure. Attenuation and sediment and debris transport is looking at the top and working our way down. And this needs to happen, as Lucinda had said, at the upper end of the watershed. Then we have potential pockets, little pockets that might be opportunities for detention between Mount Eldon Estates and Route 66. The underlying theme, though, is we must plan for conveyance through the city. Those opportunities for attenuation will not address all of the post-burn flows that Joe described. And we need to optimize that existing system, and we need to have a comprehensive model to inform some of those strategies. So I'm going to start at the very top of the watershed. The objective at the top of the watershed is to reduce our sediment load, to reduce that large woody debris coming downstream and plugging the system. We need to look at forest restoration in the non-burn area, as Lucinda had said earlier. And then there's an opportunity here for an alluvial fan. And I'll show you some what that might look like on the next slide. We also talked about channel stabilization and the challenges with channel stabilization. The terrain in this upper watershed is so steep. It is difficult, if perhaps not impossible, to get large equipment and material in there to perform that work. And then maintenance and monitoring of how that debris flow happens, how that sediment moves, will be a long-term effort, ongoing effort. The photos on the left are an example from the Schultz Mitigation project. We've got a log rundown structure on the top left photo. There is some channelization, stabilization underway in that bottom right photo there. And this worked great for the Schultz watershed. It may not work as well for the museum flood area and the Spruce watershed. We don't necessarily have wide channels with gradual grades to be able to do that type of channel restoration.
Yep,
but there are opportunities in a few locations where we could do this for some mitigation of that debris and sediment loading. So moving a little bit south on this map, this is the end of Paradise right here. Thank you, right there. And then we have the Mount Eldon Estates neighborhood. And this is Forest Service in this zone. As we talked about possible mitigation in this area, we talked about channel improvements through Mount Eldon Estates. There's some variation, there's some scour happening, and we need to get in there and do some work to help stabilize that channel, to have some consistent capacity through that channel section. As we move downstream, just north of Paradise, there, this is an opportunity for a possible offline basin. Things that we wrestled with, things that we talked a lot about as groups. What is the access to that? We know how much maintenance a basin requires, ongoing for the duration. And how do we get there? What does that look like? What does that mean? Is it feasible? There could be that smaller area for attenuation and attenuation. So just a quick definition on what that means. Attenuation is when we hold back the water and then slowly release it over an extended period of time. Instead of having a large rush of water, we just slow it down. It doesn't change the volume of water. It just holds it back and slows it down. And that's the purpose of a detention basin, is to provide that attenuation to reduce some of those surges. We also talked about an alluvial fan at that same area. Similar to the upper part of the watershed. Alluvial fans do not require as much maintenance because their primary purpose is for sediment and debris removal and to hold that back. There is a challenge with doing an alluvial fan in this particular area because we have a pretty well-defined channel through this zone. And as you saw in the photo, an alluvial fan is more spread out in a broader, less sloped area. But there could be an opportunity here at this location. And as we said before, some of this upper part of the watershed, we're really focused on that sediment removal or sediment reduction. It's impossible to remove. Sediment reduction and debris removal and reduction.
And I would say one of the primary purposes for that sediment removal is to help the systems that we have in place today function better than we're seeing in the condition of flows that we're getting right now, because we're getting a lot of that sediment transport into the city systems that is frankly causing problems currently.
Logging it up.
Logging it up. Thanks, Gary. All right, we're going to move downstream a little bit. This is the cul-de-sac on Paradise. And then right down here in the bottom right of the image, that is the culvert crossing at Linda Vista. Through here, we talked about channel widening. We have gotten the nod of approval, Christopher, from US Forest Service to do some channel widening at the pinch point, the existing pinch point at the very top of Paradise. And this is great news and work that we can move on very soon. So there'll be some widening at that location to provide some additional capacity. We did talk about possible more permanent barriers through this section. That's not necessarily in the immediate work that I just mentioned. That's channel widening. And then as we move a little bit further south, we talked about, oh, right down there, sorry about that. At the end of Park, there is great access to a city-owned parcel, that there may be an opportunity at this location to provide some attenuation, provide an additional area for sediment dropout. It's got great access and we can make the most of it at that location. And I'm going to go to the next slide to talk about the Linda Vista crossing, which is right up here, Linda Vista. This is the Y, or the wedge, I think is what we're calling it at Cedar at the slip lane. And then we have Cedar in the bottom part of the photo here. Now, Linda Vista, we need to follow to the outfall. So as we talk about strategies, strategies like storm drain infrastructure, whatever strategy we have in that infrastructure or increased channel conveyance, we have to chase that all the way down, all the way south. So as we talked about as a group, opportunities to go to the east side of the existing channel or to the west side of the existing channel, we know that we need to chase that down all the way down through Sunnyside to Route 66. I believe I could say with confidence, it's unanimous in the engineering group that we need to look for bypass, that we need to look for additional conveyance at the Linda Vista crossing. And that simply increasing at the Linda Vista crossing would be pushing a problem, increasing for a larger storm event would be causing some adverse downstream impacts. So we need to look for an alternative route. And that new conveyance, which could be to the west, perhaps a conveyance that comes down one of these streets here, a western conveyance, or perhaps a little bit to the east, a conveyance. This is Forest Service property here, the back of Mount Eldon Middle School here, possible conveyance east or west. And then when we do that, we look for opportunities for attenuation. Where would it be possible for a detention facility to provide that attenuation? Perhaps this city-owned parcel, for example, would be one opportunity. Perhaps Forest Service would be another opportunity. And it goes back to which way makes the most sense. An additional study is needed to be able to do that bypass or divert some of the flow out of the channel.
And I think, Julie, when you're talking about conveyance in this sense off of Linda Vista and down through Sunnyside, we're talking about another underground storm drain system or pipe, right? That's what you're
Correct.
talking about.
Correct. We're talking about some pretty extensive infrastructure improvements. Right. So moving to the north section of Sunnyside, and I should ask, Gary, is there anything that you would like to add that you feel that
I think the only thing that I would add is when we start to talk about infrastructure changes within the city limits, those become very impactful. They're very costly. And so we need to have a better understanding of the mitigation measures that we're trying to put in place upstream of there, what impacts that has downstream within city limits, and have a better understanding of what the existing city infrastructure can handle. And that's one thing that we came away with as a priority, was having a better understanding of what those mitigation measures will accomplish, and better understanding what the city infrastructure can handle in its existing conditions. So that was one of the primary takeaways that we had from the meeting today.
Thanks for that, Gary. So moving through North Sunnyside, possible mitigation, I think we can say we all generally agree we need to maintain. There's a 60-inch storm drain that runs under a portion of the channel. This is just north of Arroyo Seco and the townhomes, that inlet. I think many are fairly familiar with that are watching today. We've got that section of storm drain at that inlet, and that extends all the way south. It continues all the way to First and Route 66. And it is important to maintain that system. It has good capacity. It certainly doesn't have enough capacity for these post-burn flows that we're seeing, but it does have capacity. So we need to maintain that. We talked about some channel hardening to increase the conveyance. So when I talk about channel hardening, I'm talking about concrete, riprap, slurry, some of those materials to kind of help with erosion on that channel, to help with efficiency on that channel. And then, as I mentioned before, we need to chase that east or west conveyance further downstream. So this is the crossing, the current crossing of Spruce Wash at Cedar. And so as we look to possible bypass conveyance, we're either going to be running down the west side of the Sunnyside neighborhood or the east side of the Sunnyside neighborhood. And where do we see opportunities where we don't have as many underground infrastructure conflicts, where we might be able to use an existing system line and be able to upsize that? And back to that pockets, looking for those pockets for detention. And one of those pockets, and this is actually underway, this is the Killip School site. We're looking to a mini regional detention basin in this area to help with that attenuation.
Before we move on.
Yep.
I just want to reiterate some of the points that we were talking about earlier in terms of cleaning out those flows in the forest areas through the use of alluvial fans and detention basins to get some of that sediment to drop out. Because as we mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of issues with our existing system clogging up, and we're not taking full advantage of the existing system we have. So a lot of those mitigation measures that we're talking about upstream will have a very big impact in how the system functions downstream in here. And some of the examples, a lot of our inlets into our underground system are compromised with the flows that we're seeing because of the sediment and debris deposits that we're getting. And so again, trying to maximize the existing system we have, and adding some of these other areas of mitigation, attenuation, detention basins, like Julie just mentioned, at the school will function better if we can have cleaner flows and have better flows coming into the city.
Moving on to South Sunnyside. Sixth is at the very top of the image here. And then you can see this is the railroad down here in the bottom right corner of the image. And again, it comes back to chasing those east or west bypass flows all the way out. We talked about that detention basin possibly at Killip Elementary School, perhaps an expansion of that basin to Ponderosa Park, but we also recognize that the park is an amenity. And to turn that into something other than its current use, we would need to find park space or be able to have both of those uses, which can become challenging. So,
You have to hit slides.
thanks. We also chasing this all the way down. If we upsize the infrastructure all the way to Route 66, all of a sudden we're increasing how much water is getting to that area. And we need to look for opportunities again for detention. So another one of those pocket areas is perhaps close to the outfall. So the outfall of Spruce Wash is at the Blimpie, the giant station at 1st and 66, a little bit across from Salsa Brava for reference. There might be an opportunity at that location, just to the south and west of that location, if there is a new outfall point to provide that attenuation, because we can't be sending more water underneath BNSF Railway than we do now. So with that, and turn it over to Lucinda.
Great, thank you, Joe and Julie. I think that's an important, overview of what was involved and what came out. Obviously, there was a tremendous amount of detail that was discussed of a very, very high, sophisticated technical nature. Thank you. I think you both did a really great job kind of boiling that down and providing a good sense about what are some of those opportunities. We put this slide in because it's so important to understand that in everything that is done, we have to make sure we understand that we're not creating any adverse impacts, either upstream or downstream. And so in this process, there's actually a whole system nationally that's been developed that you look at this. And we did this in Schultz. One of the policies that was adopted by the Flood Control District Board of Directors was to adopt a no adverse impact set of standards. And that analysis was done by an independent third party engineering firm with that expertise. And we would obviously strongly recommend that we adopt that approach and that policy both within the county and within the city for all of these projects. It's really important because frankly, as soon as you take one step, people will begin to perceive, and then you may have a large event or something, and then people will say, well, whatever you did upstream, and we certainly have had this already, and in all the areas where people have said, well, you did this, and now you're causing this, and we're always very, very cognizant of that, and looking at how we manage and frankly regulate the floodplains, is always a challenge. So the other things that I want to just talk about, and I think you can go ahead and go to the next slide here. Before I jump into I'll come back to that. Let's go ahead. Yeah, we'll go to the next slide here to the next steps. So in terms of next steps, these are really what we see as some of the crucial next steps. First is developing that overall drainage master plan. So, and this is particularly crucial. It is an integrated system, above and below the city, but it's particularly critical for the city infrastructure and looking at, as Joe saying, how do we best optimize the system in the city? Number you know, another two key steps, as I mentioned earlier, are crucial, is we got to get the rest of the watershed up there. We have to get that thinned. It must be, that forest needs to be restored. That watershed needs forest restoration. And in addition, that watershed restoration work that's largely on Forest Service land, that needs to take place. Those two are fundamental to everything else we're going to do. And the alluvial fan work, when we say watershed restoration, that's working with those alluvial fans to make sure that they have the long-term capacity to capture and reduce sediment, and whatever channel stabilization we can do to reduce sediment production. And then another factor we talked about is dead trees. As those trees that were burned die, they're going to fall over and they become mobilized by flood events. And we need to look at working with the Forest Service to get those dead trees managed in some way so they don't end up in infrastructure downstream. Immediate design work. One of the first steps is calculating this sediment loading and coming up with a really good estimate of what do we think is really coming off this watershed, and what, in terms of the mitigation measures, the watershed restoration, what do we think we can capture? Because that will really influence all the engineering downstream. As I mentioned, the sediment debris flow, all of that, the restoration of the channels, strengthening those channels through Mount Eldon Estates, very important work. This is work we can do sooner, and we need to do soon. The channel widening and end of Paradises was mentioned. We've gotten approval to move forward with that. The intention is to move forward with that very soon. A potential detention, that attenuation at the wedge there at the Cedar slip lane. That is something that we want to look at right away as an opportunity. And then the detention basin, I think, that are at Killip, those are under design, those have been designed. We need to review those designs, make sure that that's an appropriate design for moving forward, so that that can be constructed along with the construction of the new Killip school. Next key step that we're already in, there's already been, as was discussed at the joint meeting on Monday, a lot of discussion and support from our congressional delegation, from Senator Sinema and Kelly, as well as from Representative O'Halloran, in helping to take those steps and provide the support for seeking funding. There is limited funding, and all the funding, again, will require that cost benefit analysis. And so, but starting down that path, first and foremost is the refunding of the Emergency Watershed Protection Program through the Natural Resources Conservation Service. This work on forest through Mount Eldon Estates and down to the top of Paradise, that is a key potential funding source. And we're gonna, that's a very high focus and priority for the county and for the district to pursue that. And then there's other funding sources. We're hopeful that the infrastructure bill that's in Congress right now will provide some potential funding for these types of projects, probably more so within the city, but they may also bring forward funding for the forest restoration that's necessary, as well as the watershed restoration work that is necessary and top priority as well. Lastly, to take on this entire effort, both the district and the city need to think about what is the staffing that's going to be needed and what is the structures within our organizations that we're going to use to implement. This is a major effort, and certainly everyone's aware the rest of the business of the city and the flood control district don't stop because we have this disaster. And we've obviously prioritized the disaster, but how are we going to work through this so that we can do this in a manner that also meets the timelines that we need to be meeting? People are suffering. There are tremendous impacts in the communities affected by this flooding. And this all needs to be done, as rapidly as we can, but also ensuring that the no adverse impact and other engineering steps are taken to ensure that it will perform and that it won't put people at risk that aren't at risk now. So I think that was the things I really wanted to share in terms of our next steps. Again, want to reiterate this integrated approach is really fundamental, and that what's fundamental going forward are those 4 feasibility criteria. And you're going to get sick of hearing them, but we're going to repeat them over and over because that fundamental set of principles and those criteria underline a lot of success that we achieved through Schultz. And that's, again, technical, financial, legal, and environmental, cultural. So I think with that, we're going to do the best we can. Again, we won't be able to mitigate to every design storm, but I want everyone to know that this team, we're all in it together, right? All right?
Yes.
We're all in it
Yes.
together.
Definitely.
You've got an incredible brain trust and team here, and everyone's very committed. They care about what's happening to people on a day-to-day basis through this whole experience. And we're ready to march forward. So thank you very much. With that, I think we have a couple of elected officials that have joined us, and they may have some questions. Can we go ahead, Lindsay, and see if any of our elected officials have any questions for us?
I have a question. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the hard work and bringing everybody together. I know this is quite a overwhelming endeavor and requires everybody on the team to really think out of the box and create the solution. My question is going back to what Lucinda just talked about in terms of timeline. I listen and I kind of see about 4 phases in here: the analysis phase, the engineering phase, and then the building implementation phase, and then also I guess 3, and then finished. What are we talking about for each of those phases? Because I hear this, we got to build this plan and we got to make some decisions, but like Lucinda said, people are suffering, and in the Sunnyside they're suffering a lot and repeatedly. And so I just want to make sure that they're not waiting another 2 years before something is implemented, because I know there's been plans before, and I know the situation is different and now it's at crisis level. But I just want to really reiterate that, people really need to see the benefit in the neighborhood, because they see things happening upstream, and I know that's important. And I'm totally supportive of that. And I know the strategy why, but the perception is that the Sunnyside gets forgotten. And then, like in this storm event, which was the worst of the 4, the damages were really evident in the Sunnyside. And so I just want to make sure that effort, I'm really excited about the alternative route. And so along with my timeline question, the other question is, right now, is the east side or west side of Sunnyside the preferred route for that second bypass or whatnot? So thank you. And I appreciate all your hard work. And I know it's not easy. I'm just trying to relay some of the frustrations that I'm getting from my constituents from the repeated impacts from the flooding in the Sunnyside neighborhood. Thank you.
Absolutely. And there are just tremendous impacts throughout the flood area. And we've, as you know, Supervisor, or District Director, we've been meeting with many of them, and we understand that. And there is an urgency, and we understand the urgency. At the same time, those steps, and I'm not going to give you a strict timeline. What I can say is from the time that we had the summit for Schultz, by the time we put the first, and there will be steps that we can take now. There'll be steps that we can take now. Certainly we're going to look at all the mitigation based upon, the flood events that we've had this season so far. And we're going revisit all that mitigation as well, because that mitigation still will have to probably get us through a couple of years. And there will be pieces of this, as I indicated, that we can move forward with fairly quickly, potentially, or more quickly within the next 2 years. But some of these major efforts, like a new conveyance, and there's got to be a much further, the level of analysis has to go on to pick that conveyance and which way it's going to go. Still, it's going to take a fair amount of background work that's going to have to be done to even start down that path, to even consider engineering it. So unfortunately, this is a tough, long slog. But I think we'll be able to peel off certain pieces of this puzzle and implement them as we go along, and ultimately, create a system that will provide much greater mitigation than we have today. Will it solve every design storm? It will not, but it will move us forward. I also want to point out on the screen is the museum flood info at coconino.az.gov. If you're viewing this on YouTube and you have questions, we won't take those questions today, but we will get back to you if you email us at that, if you have comments or questions, and we will provide answers back to those through that mechanism. As we're saying, we're growing this frequently asked questions piece, and we'll get that out to everyone in the flood area. So other questions or comments?
I just wanted to say thank you, Lucinda, for saying that about the pieces and the overall major report. I know there's still the analysis and we're still looking on which pieces will be where. I really appreciate that long view and understand that it's going to be several years to get that implemented. What I would suggest is that the pieces that can be implemented quickly, if that can be shared with the community, so that way they know what's going on and how it fits into that bigger puzzle once you have that bigger puzzle established. So
absolutely.
I really appreciate all the work that went into it, and I really understand how the watershed is impacted by each section, and I do want to see us address it at each section. And I did want to put in a plug for the detention basin at the top of Paradise, or in that area up in there. I thought that was a really good idea. So I'm looking forward to seeing how we can get that fan in there and what can be done. But I'm excited to see that there is a long-term plan that's starting to form, and just want to encourage you to please share that with the pieces that are going to be done quickly to the community, so they understand how that fits into the bigger picture.
Absolutely. And continuing the communication with the community is going to be critical. And so I think one of our next steps is what's the communication plan to get this information out in a digestible way, right? And help people understand what is going on and the work that'll be taking place. So thank you.
If I may also, Patrice Horstman, Supervisor District 1, and obviously I'm kind of upstream. My district is upstream from Supervisor Vasquez's. And, of course, I am very pleased for all of the work that's been done in such a short period of time by so many of you, the city, the county, and all of the partners that have engaged in this. And I have to say that it gives me a bit of hope. And I think that there are more options available than I was afraid might be available. And I think it's also important that members of the city and members in the county, our constituents who have been so affected by this, understand that there are two options. There is the short term, which I know we're attempting to do the mitigation on a short-term level, and then the long-term mitigation. And that this is really an overall watershed issue, and it needs an overall project that affects the whole watershed. In other words, what we do upstream is going to affect downstream, and so this has really got to be all of us in this together, and try to do what we can across that whole watershed. And I'm very pleased to hear that the top of Paradise, of course, that's upstream, and will certainly affect and help and assist, hopefully, some mitigation going downstream. At the top of Paradise, it looks like some of the barriers that we have at the Forest Service have hopefully been alleviated, and that we can start on some emergency projects. I also want to echo what Supervisor Vasquez said, in that it's going to be important that we get this out in a digestible format to the community, so they understand what is going on, both short term and what's the long term. And then last but not least, of course, that the long term, especially some of the concepts that you've come up with, they sound excellent. They also sound like it's exceedingly expensive. So I think it is important for everybody to understand that there are revenue limits that the city has and the county has, and that we need to do what we can to engage our partners, our representative Tom O'Halloran, and our senators, Sinema and also Mark Kelly, to assist us in getting that EWPP funded. That is going to be essential in order for us to be able to do some of this long-term mitigation. And I also know that the infrastructure bill that's being looked at in the House also has in it watershed protections and things that we can look at. And then last, but certainly not least, we have to understand that this was one watershed that has been affected, that has caused this kind of disruption to the city of Flagstaff and to our Coconino County residents in the Mount Eldon Estates area. It is really imperative that we have the time, the commitment, and find the money in order to do the forest restoration projects and the thinning that we need to do on the west slope up there in the San Francisco Peaks. This was one watershed. If we have other watersheds that are affected because of fires and post-wildfire flooding, then everything that we're even looking at now isn't going to be enough. So we really need to make a commitment from our community, a commitment to understand the importance of doing the forest restoration and to provide the mitigation here on the west slope of the San Francisco Peaks. So with that, I want to thank all of you for your attention, your commitment, and your assistance here to us in Coconino County and the city of Flagstaff. Thank you all for all your hard work on this.
Thank you. And thank you, Supervisor, for emphasizing that we can't diminish the investment in forest restoration. Several years ago, the county and district identified that as the #1 public safety threat to the county was wildfire and post-wildfire flooding. And we continue to see that, and that continues to be confirmed for us, unfortunately, and making those investments. And again, as I mentioned Monday at the joint meeting, if we have a fire similarly on the west flank of the peaks and experience this level of flooding through downtown Flagstaff, it'll be devastating to families, property owners, the business community, our economy. So there's other, we have to keep our eye on that initiative and continue to move that initiative forward, both at the city and at the district and county level.
It affects the health and safety and welfare of our citizens. So
Absolutely.
We're not just talking about property then. So
Absolutely.
It's important to keep that commitment front and center as well. So thank you.
Absolutely. All right.
Lucinda,
There she goes.
Councilmember Daggett has her hand up.
Right, go ahead, Councilmember.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you all for taking so much time to sit down and play out these scenarios and then get it ready to present to us. I know that this was a lot of work coming after weeks and weeks and weeks of a lot of work. So thank you. I also want to recognize the challenges and the opportunities that we face with so many agencies needing to be involved in the planning and the implementation. So thank you for those partnerships and working together thus far. And I would like to better understand the decision points and the process for those decisions moving forward.
Certainly. Thank you, Vice Mayor Daggett. Appreciate your acknowledging that this team and many that aren't in this room right now have put in the level of effort that's gone on in preparing the mitigation, putting the mitigation in place, and then responding over this summer and since actually 2019. And, you know, in terms of what are those decision points, my sense is that there'll be some policy level decision points that'll come forward and probably within the next 3 to 6 months. And those will involve, you know, are we either district or city combined going to pursue specific funding opportunities as those as we pursue those, making that decision to go forward to pursue those, and then the larger picture of this design storm and what type of criteria are we going to put into place for the no adverse impact analysis and so forth. With Schultz, we adopted the design storm as well as the no adverse impact and as a drainage policy for that Schultz flood area. That'll be a determining point whether the city wants to do that or not. That'll be a decision point. And then as we move through these projects, those projects will come forward to you for decision points, you know, whether you want to move forward with those and you know, and this is it's a process of, you know, you do a certain amount of design on a project, you get to 30%, you go out and you talk to the community, you know, you get feedback, you have to bring it to the council, and in your case, get, you know, and keep that education and communication process going. And I think the other key thing in the next 3 to 6 months is really looking financially. What are the opportunities? Because all the federal funding requires a match. And so looking at what are the potential funding sources for both the organizations, and what are ways to raise funds locally to make that match. And that will be a key discussion point and decision point, you know, that will take on throughout this process, but there has to be kind of an overarching look at that coming forward. In Schultz, the Flood Control District Board of Directors made a decision to increase the Flood Control District tax and to support the mitigation, to make those matches that were required. But as we all know, every funding source has a statutory cap and other realities of financial impacts to people, right? So these are really tough decisions. These are going to be very tough decisions at the technical level, tough decisions at the financial level. There's legal risk mitigation plans that have to be put into place. This is tough. These are tough decisions.
Lucinda, would you say that there's also going to be decision points in the next week to 3 weeks about
Yes, absolutely.
moving the engineering forward to get to the conceptual level and to adopt the strategies that are
Absolutely.
for the low hanging fruit just in the next couple of weeks?
I mean,
will be coming to the board and to the council.
yeah, I mean, there'll be a decision made. We've gotten approval from the Forest Service to move forward with widening the channel at the top of Paradise. That's a decision that Andy and I have to bring forward to the organizations. Do we want to move forward with that or not? Here's the cost, here's the implications.
And then the cost
So-
for the conceptual engineering, it's a very real thing.
It's a very real thing. It's a very real thing. And laying that plan out and how is that structure going to move forward? Getting the design, the drainage plan done, the sediment study done. So there are a lot of cost decisions and process decisions that will have to be made.
Thank you.
Good
And
question. Thank you.
And also, I would just like to say that I, for one, am really grateful that this is the team that we have assembled moving this forward, because it gives me as a elected person a lot of confidence. And so again, I just want to thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the confidence. All right, were there any other, can we flash back to the other screen there? Is there any other questions or comments? I think are we good there? Okay,
And as of now, there are no other hands raised.
all right, thank you very much. And I want to thank our technical team here that's Lindsay Daly, our county clerk. I want to thank Alex Fisher for doing the YouTube streaming. And for those that participated in YouTube, thank you for your attention and time. And I want to thank the great team here at NAU High Country Conference Center that supported us over the last 2 days. Appreciate everyone. And again, thank you to this fabulous team. Onward. Thank you.
Thank you.